Welcome back, everyone, to my round 7 recap of the Gibraltar Battle of the Sexes tournament. This one, I played the well-known player, Grandmaster Pia Cramling. She was the captain of the women's team, and she's also the mother of well-known streamer Anna Cramling, who I've collabed with a few times in the past. And this was a really fun and interesting and strategic game. So let's jump into it. It started with a ready opening, which very quickly transposed into a Queen's Gambit after c4, e6. I was staying in my comfort zone. I've been playing the Queen's Gambit declined almost my whole chess career, and this is a position I've had many times. And the main moves for white usually are knight c3 or g3, but Pia played an interesting move order here, bishop to g5, which I was a little bit prepared for during the game. And I had looked at this position probably for like 20 or 30 minutes the morning of the game. And I had decided that I would play a move that I've never played before, is d takes c4. And the point of this move is black is going into kind of a delayed Queen's Gambit accepted. Now, I don't entirely know what to call this opening because it's not quite a Rosen. Lichess calls this the Queen's Gambit declined traditional variation. But d takes c4, it's one of the more confrontational moves because I'm already questioning how white will win back the pawn. And if white wants to really test me, I think the most critical move here is to play e4, and then things can get very tactical very quickly. I was going to play c5 here, and then there's a line e5, h6, and position can get really messy. But I knew Pia is a more solid positional player, and she didn't go into the tactical line, but rather played a solid line with queen a4, very clearly intending to soon win back the pawn. I blocked the check with knight b d7, and then rather than taking the pawn with the queen right away, she played pawn e3, and then recaptured the pawn with the bishop. And I actually had this position on my computer screen a few hours before the game, so this was one of the positions I was expecting, and I prepared the very simple castling with the idea that now my knight is unpinned, and black is threatening knight to b6 to try and get the bishop pair. So white essentially has to retreat either the queen or the bishop. And the only move I looked at before the game was bishop to e2. But Pia played a very reasonable move, queen c2. Same idea that knight b6 is no longer a fork. And here I play a very thematic pawn c5, dc5. And here it looks most natural to take back with a knight. But I decided to play queen a5 check. I thought this was a stronger option, just gives black a bit more initiative, because after knight c3, I can take on c5 and hit the bishop. Also activate the queen. The queen does eye the bishop on g5. And I thought black has a very simple plan here. After bishop to d3, I play b6, and simply trying to complete development, improve my worst place piece on c8. And if I get in one more move, bishop to b7, my rooks can then come in, and I'll also be having some ideas of taking on f3, removing the guard of the bishop, which is still pressured by the queen. So already I was feeling quite comfortable here. And then white played the move pawn to a3, which it looks a little bit slow at first, but the plan is to play pawn b4 and expand on the queen side. I decided to just complete development, bishop e7, and then pawn b4, queen c7. Once we got to this position, I should point out that white does have a couple tactical ideas. First idea I should mention is bishop takes h7, which at first looks like it wins a pawn because there is a pin with the bishop pinning the knight to my bishop on e7. However, if white plays this, then I can simply take back, and after bishop takes e7, then black just takes over initiative. I would have rook f to c8, creating the battery and a very strong pin along the c-file. And I was calculating a few moves further here. If rook c1, I would take, and then knight to e5, which essentially traps the bishop and just creates too many threats for white to deal with. So this would be completely winning for black. So bishop takes h7 does not work for white. And then the other idea, which I'll admit during the game I had slightly miscalculated is what happens if white plays knight to d5. And I was very much aware of this move, and it turns out this is a blunder for white because of black's response. But during the game, I missed the best response for black. I was calculating takes, 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 and then it would be a trade where white gets a bishop pair. And I actually thought she would go for this. But then after the game, she was telling me she was looking at this line and realized that in this position, black has a nice in-between move, bishop takes b4. And black just wins a pawn here after takes, takes. White's down a pawn, and this would just be better for black. So both knight d5 and bishop takes h7, they're moves that white wants to play, but they don't work tactically. And for this reason, white had to find a different move here. So she played rook to c1, which is very logical, reinforces the c file. However, this did give me time to grab some initiative of my own, and wasted no time here. I took on f3, takes, and knight e5. And even though I conceded the bishop pair temporarily, I do damage the kingside pawn structure. I hit the bishop on d3, threatening knight f3, and white has to be really careful here, just not to allow things to completely collapse. And she started with bishop takes f6. Now I do have to be careful because if I take back, I might allow bishop takes h7. So I decided to take on d3 first with check, and after takes, takes. Position simplifies a bit, but we're beginning to see once the dust is settling, black is just having a clear advantage here with the rooks ready to come in. White is not yet castled. It's also a bishop versus knight scenario where the bishop is probably a bit preferable over the knight. And there's a nice calculation here, is that if white castles, which looks to be one of the most natural moves, then I have a way to win material pretty quickly, is to play rook a to d8. Now during the game, I had started my calculation with rook f d8, which looks to be a little bit more natural. However, this would allow knight to d5, and after takes, white can take back with the queen, and unfortunately my rook on a8 is hanging. So compare this to the other line. If I start with rook a d8, then if knight d5, I can safely take, and if queen takes, the queen's not hitting anything on a8, and I can take on c1, and it's black who's going to be up a piece in the end after takes and takes. So going back, I think it's useful to kind of understand the tactical ideas in this position and show that white had to be really, really careful not to just lose material right away. And here she played a funny move, but I think it turns out to be one of the best moves, is king to e2. I like to call this delayed bomb cloud, just giving up on the prospect of castling and putting the king where it does look a little bit iffy in the center, but it is sheltered by the pawns, and white does try to connect the rooks and get the rook on h1 to a more useful place. So I went ahead, played rook a c8, and now I have 3 attackers against the knight, and now really questioning how white will deal with the simple threat of bishop takes c3. And here, Pia made her first kind of big blunder of the game. What white should do here is go for more simplification. The best move is knight to e4. Now, this would allow me to get 2 rooks for a queen, but if we had entered this line, white can even take on f6 after takes. I was calculating this during the game and thought black is the only one with winning chances, given that the 2 rooks can sometimes overpower the queen. Turns out the engine just says it's completely equal here after the move queen d4. Now the position would still have some life, and I would still probably try and play on for a win, but this is definitely better for white compared to what happened in the game. Going back, white decided not to go for the imbalance of material and tried to keep pieces on the board, and Pia played the move knight to a2, which I think was played with good intention to just try and get initiative against my queen, defend the rook. The problem with this move is the knight turns out to be really misplaced, and black has a really nice response here. Queen to e5, just avoiding any sort of simplification, and now having a really big threat of queen to b2. And the threat is actually queen b2, queen d2, and then just win the pawn on a3. And it's really hard for white to keep everything defended here, as we'll see. What white played in the game was pawn a4, trying to just get the pawn to a more secure square. But still, after queen b2, queen d2, I had to move queen to b3. And now there's just too many targets on the queen side, and it's really just impossible for white to hold on to all the material. After takes, rook c1, I was happy to take, and after knight takes, then take on a4. And I was feeling really good at this point because we simplified, and I won a pawn, and I'm not getting mated on the back rank because my bishop does control the d8 square. So from here, it was a question how I convert the extra pawn into a winning position. And I will say that it wasn't easy. Going forward, white put up a lot of resistance, and I've learned from this tournament, just playing so many strong players, that even when I get a better or winning position, it can still be really difficult and take a lot of effort and energy to convert an advantage into a win. But thankfully, the position was pretty safe to play, and it was a matter of making small improvements. So white here improved the knight with knight d3. And next several moves were just kind of natural improving moves. Brought the queen to a more central square. I made Luft for my king. I knew because I have a dark square bishop, my pawns are probably best on light squares. And there was a subtle tactical idea here. When I played g6, I could say, oh no, my pawn, but if white takes the pawn, then I would check the king and win the knight by force. So a7 pawn can't be taken, the queen has to cover c2. So she played f4 here, and game continued, pawn h5, pawn h3. Both of us were kind of just waiting, making small improvements, king g7, king d2. And then here I realized that because the king is on d2, this allows me to play nice move pawn a5. And of course, it's a strategy whenever there's 2 versus 1. From black's perspective, I want to make a pass pawn on the queen side, and a5 accomplishes this because after takes, I have the nice in-between move, queen c3 check, now covering a5, and then I take back with the pawn. And yeah, now I have a passed a pawn, and knights are pretty notorious for being clumsy defenders against outside passed pawns. And I was happy that my bishop is already controlling the queening square. And from here, I thought it was going to be pretty simple to just gradually advance the pawn. But as we're going to see, white still put up resistance. Pia played the move queen to a4, still covering c2, blockading the pawn. And I can't easily play queen b4 because the knight is, of course, controlling b4. So it's still a question how black makes progress. And as we're going to see for the next several moves, I just kind of danced around trying to find the optimal setup for my queen and bishop. So I started with queen c7. She actually expanded here with pawn to e4, which was a slight surprise. And I moved back. Now that the d4 square is no longer controlled by the pawn, I do have ideas of bishop d4 or even queen d4. So for this reason, she played king to e3. And even though the king looks really exploitable on e3, it's really not easy to attack because the knight controls all the key checking squares. This is very typical whenever a knight is just a square adjacent to the king. It can be a very useful defensive piece. So I decided to play bishop e7 here, some ideas of bishop c5 or bishop to b4. She moved back to e2. Played bishop to b4, queen b5, queen d4, and here we actually ended up repeating a couple times. Played bishop c3, knight c5, bishop to e1, knight moved back. I realized my bishop isn't really accomplishing much on e1. Moved back to c3. She moved back to c5. So I had to be careful not to repeat 3 times, otherwise that would allow her to claim repetition. And I brought the bishop back to b4. She played knight d3, and this was the 41st move. So we both got an extra half hour on the clock, and I played move bishop to d6. And turns out that after a lot of maneuvering, I finally found a really nice setup for my pieces. The queen is really nicely centralized. The bishop dominates the knight on d3. And even though white still has everything defended, it turns out that it's really difficult to find a move for white. And white is pretty much in Zugzwang here. She spent the next probably 10 to 15 minutes thinking on the next move, like what to do for white. It's really hard to find a move because the king is tied down to defending e4. The queen is tied down to defend the knight, so there's no queen takes a5. And meanwhile, I'm ready to just start pushing the pawn, and there's really no good active move for the knight. I also point out that e5 doesn't really accomplish much. I would just play bishop e7, and white is still in kind of the same predicament. So after a long think from white, she played the move queen to b2, offering a queen trade. And I was happy to see this move because after takes and takes, this is a pretty straightforward winning endgame for black, just because the knight constantly has to watch out for the a pawn advancing, and meanwhile I can make progress on the king side. I started here with the move bishop to c5, aiming to optimize the bishop fully with bishop d4. She played king e2, bishop d4, and unfortunately for white, if the only way to move the knight and prevent the a-pawn from moving is to put the knight on a4 on the edge, but now the knight is completely dominated by the bishop, and I continue making progress on the king side, play king f6, f3, and now g5. And here it's all about creating a pathway for my king to get through to eventually win the h-pawn and make a second outside pass pawn. And there's really not much white can do here. She played the move king d3. I put my bishop all the way back on g1. e5 was played, king f5. And after takes, knight to c3. Pretty sure she was hoping for king f4, after which white would get a fork on e2. Now, this might still be winning for black, actually, but decided not to take any risks. Played the move king h4. Now the h3 pawn is a goner, and she actually just resigned in this position because it's really difficult to even win the pawn and also deal with the issues on the king side. So I was very pleased to convert the endgame and not spoil my advantage, especially against such a strong opponent. I think in this game, the opening worked out really nicely. I was able to neutralize from early on, and then after one kind of slip up in the middle game with this knight a2 move, this is kind of the key turning point where things very much went in my favor. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the game. It was a fun one to play. It was honor just to play a player like Pia Cramling. So yeah, hope you learned a thing or two. If you have questions or comments, leave them below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.